Hello and welcome to this evening's Capstone Project Final Briefings. My name is Lynette Witter, and I'm a lecturer in discipline in the Sustainability Management program here and serve as a faculty advisor in the Capstone workshop in the spring semester. The Integrative Capstone Workshop is the culminating educational experience for students in the Masters of Sustainability Management program. Since the program's inception, students have completed more than 80 hands-on projects for diverse clients internationally. Each student team undertakes a specific analytic project, serving as consultants for a public or nonprofit client organization. Projects address critical sustainability management issues and give students real-world experience in understanding the constraints under which sustainability managers operate. The workshop program is designed to integrate the distinct fields introduced throughout the master's program, and projects enable students to draw on both the analytical knowledge and the practical skills they've gained. This summer, students have undertaken the project Moving the Forest Carbon Efficiency Curve, a strategic look at the options for expanding access to the California GHG Cap and Trade program, for the Vermont Land Trust and Lime Timber. Students have completed the summer 2017 Capstone Workshop under the guidance of Professor Ralph Schmidt. Ralph's own work with forests first began with the Peace Corps in 1970. He has served as the Director of Forest Programs at the United Nations Development Program in New York and led Candlewood Forest Group, the first FSC-certified natural forest operation in Argentina. And now please join me in welcoming Brian Hong, who will give the final briefing for the Capstone project, Moving the Forest Carbon Efficiency Curve. At the conclusion of the briefing, we will have 10 minutes for questions from the audience, followed by a brief reception. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm here to talk to you about our Capstone project on forest carbon offsets in Vermont. My team for the project is Sarah Barbato, Claire Costello, myself, Haley Mole, Derek Noah, Diana Ramos, Naomi Rogoff, and Chris Tan, and as mentioned, our faculty advisor is Ralph Schmidt. I also wanted to note that many of the pictures used in our presentation are from our actual field trip to Vermont. Before we get into the presentation, we wanted to answer the simple question: why is our topic important? And that is, of course, because forests help prevent climate change by sequestering CO2 emissions. Now on to the agenda. Tonight I'll brief you on our task overview and team strategy, an overview of the Vermont forest and carbon offsets, and the specifics of carbon offset projects, including aggregation. Following that, I'll brief you on the barriers that our team determined, our proposed financial model and business plan, along with other considerations. This semester, our clients asked us to analyze the financial viability of forest carbon offsets under the California Cap and Trade compliance offset market. In addition, we're looking at the viability of aggregating smaller forest properties as single carbon offset projects. We did this by creating two deliverables: a market analysis of carbon offset opportunities in the US, and a financial projection and business model for project development. The two companies we work for this summer are the Vermont Land Trust and Lime Timber Company. VLT is a nonprofit land trust whose mission is to protect and conserve farms and forests in Vermont. They do this mostly through conservation easements. Lime Timber is a timber investment management organization focusing on the acquisition and sustainable management of lands with unique conservation values. They implement sustainable timber harvesting and work with the Forest Stewardship Council to certify their working timber properties. VLT and Lime Timber have a shared interest in permanently conserving working forests and wanted to examine the opportunity that forest carbon offsets could bring and aid in conservation efforts. We approached the challenge by creating a strategy to make sure we covered all of our bases as a group. We spent time researching and making sure we understood the scientific complexity of carbon sequestration within forests, the legislative parameters of AB 32, and the conditions of forestry in the state of Vermont. We gathered as much industry knowledge as we could from professionals with experience in the different aspects of foreign carbon offset projects, and performed case study analyses to learn from successfully submitted contracts. We then worked on creating a precise financial analysis accompanied by a proposed business model for VLT. We finally concluded by identifying key barriers and possible solutions and considered areas for further research. Before we could begin working on the deliverables, it was essential to understand some key facts about the forests in Vermont. 78% of the state is covered in forest, 80% of which is privately owned. The forest provides recreation, tourism, and a range of other benefits such as ecosystem services, climate change impact mitigation, and improving air and water quality. In addition, the forest contributes $3.4 billion annually to the state economy through forest-related industries such as timber harvesting and maple production. Lastly, a key piece to understanding the Vermont forests is that the average property size is around 1,100 acres, considered small in the world of carbon offsets. A trend of parcelization has occurred, making lot sizes shrink over time. Now we're going to move into California Assembly Bill 32, the main carbon market in the US. In 2006, California passed AB 32, the California Global Warming Solutions Act, which requires California to reduce their GHG emissions to 1990 levels by 2020, a reduction of 15% over business as usual. This legislation also established a cap-and-trade system which puts a cap on the total emissions from specific emitters in the state and then allocates them allowances to these emitters. These allowances can then be sold and traded to meet their emissions requirements. Emitters can also purchase carbon offsets, compliance carbon offsets to meet up to 8% of their emissions. In a newly passed and signed legislation, California extended their cap-and-trade system to 2030, but made a few changes to the offset market. Starting in 2020, an emitter can only use offsets to meet up to 4% of their emissions, with half of those offsets coming from projects within California. The graph on the right-hand side illustrates the success of the program so far, as GDP has grown while emissions have fallen. So what is a carbon offset? A carbon offset is a reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases made in order to compensate or to offset an emission made elsewhere. One carbon offset is typically equal to 1 ton of CO2e. There are a variety of offsets available, but for this project, we're only concerned with forest carbon offsets. They are currently the most popular type of offset, with more than half of the total number of issued offsets being forest. Forest offsets have produced over $440 million in revenue so far for their owners. Carbon offsets have a few criteria that they need to meet, including being real, permanent, quantifiable, verifiable, enforceable, and additional. The two main criteria that needs to be considered is the additionality and permanence. Additionality refers to the idea that a project needs to prove it is sequestering extra carbon. In other words, that the carbon sequestration would not have happened without this project. Permanence refers to the concept that the carbon sequestration must be maintained for at least 125 years. If the project sequesters carbon for 10 years and then the trees are cut down or lost to natural disasters, the carbon storage is lost. To protect against this carbon loss, every project submits a portion of their credits to an insurance pool. There are three types of forest carbon projects: improved management, avoided conversion, and reforestation or afforestation. Improved forest management involves implementing sustainable forest harvesting practices to increase carbon in the forest and wood products. This is the most popular type of project and is best suited for our clients and landowners in Vermont. Avoided conversion projects take place in forests with a high likelihood of forest and carbon loss, where they aim to commit to keep the forest as forests. This typically occurs in areas that are under high development pressure. In reforestation or afforestation, carbon is sequestered through the recreation of forests that were previously destroyed. As part of our research, our group compiled a list of every forest carbon offset project in AB 32. These graphs are a summary of our findings. On the left-hand side, we see that although there is a wide variability in the credits per acre for projects, the larger projects seem to, on average, have lower credits per acre than the smaller projects. On the right-hand side, we see that this is most apparent when focusing in on the smaller projects of 5,000 acres or less. There's a triangle at the lower left of the graph where there have not been any projects thus far. And this triangle reflects that once a project falls below 2,000 acres, they require a significantly higher number of credits per acre. In order to provide access to the carbon markets for most small forest owners, projects then need to be aggregated. The average small forest acreage is insufficient for an individual project, as carbon is traded in blocks of 100 tons of CO2e, and northeastern forests are only able to generate between 0.6 to 6 CO2e per acre. Aggregation allows small forest owners to share fixed costs and meet market requirements for project size. The concept of aggregating multiple small forests for combined submission as an offset project has been successful in many cases across the voluntary markets, which are listed below, but is more difficult to address in a compliance market scenario like AB 32 because of the additional requirements. For this project, there were multiple barriers we addressed to make an aggregated project feasible. First, small land parcel sizes are expensive and time-consuming to inventory. However, new technology can reduce the inventorying cost, such as Forest Carbon Works app that collects data with the smartphone, or Sylvia Terra's virtual forest to collect inventory data. We've already gone over aggregation as a solution to small parcel size in the previous slide. Currently, market uncertainty for carbon offsets is still a concern for many forest owners. However, the recent market extension to 2030 provides some confidence in the future outlook. Despite the reduction in offsets allowed, the market was operating at only 25% of its past allowance, meaning that the restriction should have minimal effect on demand. AB 32 also includes a price floor, which provides a stable price for future cash flows. There are also a number of social challenges to deal with. Gaining landowners' trust and the ability to work together for the 125-year project life cycle is difficult. VLT should utilize already existing relationships with conservation-minded landowners. Addressing these barriers allowed us to create a working business model in getting small parcels enrolled in the AB 32 market. We've also researched a number of other considerations that could help reduce some of the barriers for aggregated projects and forest offsets in general in the near future. Technology is being developed that looks promising for cutting costs associated with inventory and verification. Some opportunities that are in development are smartphone app for inventorying, aerial imaging, simulation, and big data analysis. However, these are ongoing developments, and the only one that's potentially market ready is the smartphone app. Another consideration was evaluating other carbon markets in the US and internationally. These are some of the markets we looked at. Overall, we found that some are more successful than others at establishing a strong market for carbon offsets. For example, the EU ETS market is very robust, while the REGI market suffers from a low offset price. There are markets set to be initiated in Canada, China, and other countries in Asia. We also studied the voluntary markets and learned of a proposed market by the International Civil Aviation Organization set to start in 2020. This scheme is strictly voluntary, but 71 states have volunteered to reduce their aviation emissions. There are currently mixed reviews for the program, but it represents great potential. The next task in our project was to analyze how our project's finances might pan out in practice. We developed a financial model utilizing our forest industry research and through discussions with industry experts. The key variables to project viability are acreage, initial carbon credits per acre, timber revenue, carbon prices, and the number of landowners. With these, each of the barriers in the previous slide is addressed. The model assumes that there are 5 landowners that need to be managed with outreach and legal costs. Many major costs, including inventorying, verification, and registration, are mostly fixed for projects under a certain size, which reflects how it is challenging to make very small projects viable. Our carbon price assumption is based on the floor price of AB 32, and our clients gave us a sample site of 1,800 acres to analyze as the basis of our model, located in Bakersfield, Vermont. As you can see, our model shows a break-even at 1,135 acres. The financial model shows that the Bakersfield site is financially viable given the assumptions, as well as initial tons of CO2 per acre of 20, but there are key risks. As mentioned, we assumed carbon prices would rise at 5% plus inflation, which is California's current policy. If carbon prices don't rise as much, revenue would decline drastically. In addition, having more landowners would cause outreach and legal costs to rise. In the worst case scenario, having 10 owners and no rise in the carbon price, there's a large negative NPV. More generally, as can be seen on the right, the smaller the acreage the project, the higher the carbon credits initially needed to make the project financially viable. The star represents that at 1,000 acres, 25 tons of CO2e per acre or more is required for financial viability. There's little effect from losses in timber revenue. Instead, carbon prices and landowners are the key risks. In order to help small forest owners in Vermont join the compliance offset market, we have proposed the following business model for VLT to pursue. VLT would act as a project owner and would use their extensive knowledge and relationships with small forest owners to create aggregated projects in geographically close areas. They would be responsible for providing the startup capital and would then submit the aggregated project through a carbon registry. VLT would receive the total project revenues and would allocate those revenues to the landowners accordingly after recouping their costs. The key success factors that we have outlined for the aggregation model in Vermont are: 1, leveraging VLT's relationships and forest knowledge for easier business development; 2, hiring a dedicated program manager to manage the aggregation projects; 3, creating a standardized legal agreement that leaves room for some flexibility with landowners; and 4, targeting forests with existing working conservation easements. To prove the viability of this model, we have analyzed a dedicated forest carbon offset aggregator, Forest Carbon Works. They have developed an innovative inventorying app, as well as standardized agreements and a pseudo-aggregation model to allow small forest owners to enter the carbon markets. In conclusion, we believe there is a viable market for forest carbon offsets in the state of Vermont. Project aggregation is possible despite its many challenges and would allow small forest owners, which comprise the majority of forests in Vermont, to join the compliance or voluntary carbon markets. We recommend that VLT implement our proposed business model or choose to partner with a dedicated forest project aggregator like Forest Carbon Works. We also encourage VLT to continue looking into technology and other markets outlined, as they may provide significant benefits to the forest offset market in the near future. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation. Now willing to take any questions anyone might have. Professor Bose?
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting presentation and business plan. I was wondering whether you thought about other states where you have the same kind of numeric dynamics so that this investment can be recouped over multiple states, or maybe even other countries. Norway, Finland come to mind.
Yeah, so the question was, have we thought of other states that can also pursue this type of aggregation model? And the question is definitely yes. Lime Timber is actually located in New Hampshire, and they were very interested in us figuring out a business model for them to pursue in their own state. Just because of the differences in forests, we were focusing mostly on the viability of the Northeast market. It can vary drastically depending on what type of forest you're looking at, but the idea, even with Vermont Land Trust, was that we would look at it for the whole Northeast as a whole. But this business model, Forest Carbon Works, is actually working out of California. They're looking at projects in the Northwest, so it's definitely, it can be replicated elsewhere. Yep.
So also, very impressive project, and I like the narrative and the way you built the story and
Thank you.
Got to the details. One of my questions is, how does this scenario compare to other states where, is there, if you look across the entire market for forest carbon credits, is this competitive, or are there better places that those seeking compliance may be
For sure.
seek first?
So the question is, how competitive is Vermont compared to other states looking at forest carbon offsets? That's a tricky question, but we're of the mindset that Vermont may be one of the harder states to implement this in because of all the small forests that they have. Where this has been typically successful in California, in Maine, they're large forest properties owned by a single landowner. But Vermont is really interested in doing this, so we do think it's viable, although there is probably lower hanging fruit in other states.
Sorry.
Yes?
I guess I have a follow-on question. Are there distinct advantages to having multiple small farmers or small landholders because of their ability to be more flexible and implement better on-the-ground practices?
So the question is there any advantage to having small landowners compared to bigger projects? So far, unfortunately, the answer is no. With small projects, you run much greater costs than you would normally. There's the complexity legally with all these different landowners, and a forest carbon project runs for a minimum of 125 years. So to get multiple landowners to agree to this type of project for that kind of time frame makes it difficult. Yeah, unfortunately, there aren't any benefits we could see compared to a single large project. Yes?
Typically, are the landowners companies or individuals?
The landowners are all individuals that we were looking with, yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Why the 125-year cutoff?
Yes, so all carbon offset projects are for a minimum 25-year contract with California, and then once that 25-year period is done, California requires you to keep the forest as forest for another 100 years, which includes updating them with new inventories and monitoring over that 100-year time cycle.
Did you seek an improved scenario?
Sorry?
Did you seek an improved scenario?
Improved scenario.
In the sense that people might want to latch on
I'm
more
not.
favorably, lower than 125 years.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the current rules that they work with. Some of the other voluntary markets have shorter time frames, but the main goal was to join AB 32, and that's because they have the highest carbon price. Yes.
I read that you talked about technological development such as big data. Could you give us an example of how big data would be used?
Yes, so I can go back to this slide. So on the right, this is actually Sylvia Terra, and what they're doing is they take all this satellite imagery, and they also couple this with some on-the-ground work, but they're actually trying to model forests using all this data that they can combine from satellite imagery. In the past, it hasn't been close to being accurate enough to do an actual inventorying, but they say that they're slowly coming towards a scenario where it actually will be as accurate as a human on the ground doing the actual inventorying.
Just to follow up on
Yes.
that, I'm surprised about the quality of that because the U.S. Forest Service database is actually very good at telling you what species are there and what the masses are there. So I don't know if Sylvia Terra is aggregating that data and appropriately processing it for Vermont because
They're looking at it countrywide. But to your point, from what we've heard from other forestry professionals, the data has to be so accurate. You're looking at within like 6 inches of a tree height for these like 20-foot, 30-foot trees. So it has to be extremely precise in order to pass that verification stage, which would actually allow you to get carbon credits. Yes.
The landowners, are they sparse or should they be adjacent to each other?
Yeah, so the idea and why we think Vermont Land Trust could be so successful, particularly as being a project aggregator, is because they know these owners personally, and you really do need that in order to get an aggregated project, because you need to get the economies of scale of actually combining these properties and having the inventorying costs and verification spread out in one property rather than going to different sites, which will increase the costs. Yes.
What type of activities need to go on? Is it simply preserving the forest so that they don't get developed, or are there more active management that's being?
So we mostly looked at improved forest management, which is what most of the projects have been so far, especially looking in Vermont. And what that actually means, most of these are working timber properties. They're actually still harvesting timber. But what they do is they lengthen their life cycle for the harvest. So instead of harvesting every 10 years, they're looking at 20, 30, 50 years. And that allows the trees to grow bigger and sequester more carbon in that time. And generally, once they've entered a project, they're only harvesting a portion of the growth, 40 to 50% of the growth year over year. So they'll keep that baseline as it is and then just harvest any growth they see in future years.